delighted to welcome Tiffany Wilding to the stage. Tiffany is a managing director and chief economist at Pimco, which some of you, or many of you will know, is one of the largest investment firms, in active management firms in bonds. Manage $1.8 trillion in assets. Once upon a time, that would have been able to buy Microsoft, but no longer. These valuations at $3 trillion, you can't buy with the entire resources of the Pimco. So Tiffany, welcome to the stage. I don't know where that came from, but.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
All right, so Tiffany, why don't you tell us, while I get set here, why don't you tell us a little bit about your job at Pimco and what is it you do?
Okay. And if my job will get taken over by AI and how quickly.
Yeah, there we go. Absolutely.
Maybe I'll ask you guys that question after this. You can let me know how I did. So
I'm pretty sure it will.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm kidding.
Well, we already have an internal bot named George that is already taking over for our undergraduate interns. So I'm sure my job is next.
Sorry, kids, you won't get an internship at Pimco next year.
Yeah, exactly.
Some of them worked for Pimco this year.
Yeah, we actually also, just as we're on the subject, and I will talk about more about what I do, but we also have another kind of bot, or if you will, that all of the things that we write at Pimco and that I write specifically, just go into this database and provides a corpus. And so you have a bot that you say, act like Tiffany Wilding, and it says, hi, I'm Tiffany Wilding. And then you ask it a question, what is your latest CPI forecast? And the bot will give it to you. What is your latest view on the US economy and on monetary policy? And it gives it to you. So it's actually quite nice because then everybody knows what your view is anytime they want it. So it is quite helpful for us. So just some of the very transparent.
So it's a robotic Tiffany that answers?
Exactly. We literally need maybe a robot just rolling around with like a screen on it.
I can see all my students sending a robot to class. If you have a class participation grade, the robot will answer, not me.
Exactly. But I focus on macroeconomic trends for Pimco. We do a lot. Our entire investment process is very much a top-down approach that is based on what we call these forums. So we have cyclical forums once a quarter. When we call it cyclical, we kind of think at an 8 to 12-month time horizon. And then we call what we call secular horizon forums, where we have that once a year. And the idea is to kind of get together as a firm. And we literally do this as a firm. There's everybody from the legal department down to anybody else that wants to come, along with the portfolio managers and economics team. And we do a forecasting exercise, but we present what we think are going to be the key risks and macro themes for markets that are going to be trading, in order to try to give our portfolio managers a bit of a kind of a roadmap on what they could expect. And so we do a lot of scenario analysis. Base case are interesting, but it's really not the base case that really makes or loses money, right? It's those risk cases. And so we try to focus a lot on that in terms of what markets are trading and what's priced in.
Great. So let's just start with so this is exactly what we would like to talk to you about. So whatever you advise your portfolio managers, just please advise us as well. But let's just start with the fundamental question. So there's been so much volatility in the economy. We had a 50 basis point rate cut not so long ago. I just read today that the US stock market has gone from being 30% of the global stock market to 50% since in the last 15 or so years.
Yeah.
So clearly, in some ways, the US is doing particularly well. How do you see sort of the state of today's, let's start with the US economy, but in the context of the global economy?
Yeah. So maybe this is an oversimplification, but maybe it's not. But the way I would just kind of look at it, taking a step back, is that we had a series of very unique, what economists call economic shocks, very unique economic shocks, right, that happened, not only the pandemic itself, but the response of governments to the pandemic, the transfers that were given to households, small businesses in the United States. I'm sure many people here might remember the PPP program, but all of this money that got into the economy, that boosted demand at a time when supply was constrained because of the pandemic. And if you're Europe, you're very close to, the invasion of Ukraine. There was a very large, sanctions on Russian energy and things like that, very large energy-related shocks, so other supply shocks happening at the same time. And what I would just argue is that as we're getting further and further away from the time that we had these just big global shocks, we're now just kind of getting into more normal conditions. And I feel like we've even forgotten what normal is, just because it's almost hard to remember now what it was like in 2019. But if you look at inflation indicators, not only in the US, but globally, you look at labor market indicators, measures of just real household wealth, supply chain stress, across these things, we're now looking more like a 2019 economy that we've, and again, not only in the US, but elsewhere than we've looked at any time since the pandemic. The one thing that does not look like a 2019 economy, though, is the level of monetary policy. And that's not only a US phenomenon, but again, it's across the DM. So we would argue that what the Fed did with cutting interest rates by 50 basis points is incredibly reasonable. Usually, historically, central banks are only cutting when they're in recession. They're not very good at forecasting recessions, but they're very good at knowing when they're happening right now, and they're cutting quickly. Right. This is a bit of a unique experience because we are actually seeing central banks that are cutting and trying to get back to whatever they think neutral policy is actually before a recession comes. So that's how I would describe it. We think the U.S. economy is is in a quite healthy place actually, and we're just normalizing, and so should policy.
So we will talk about AI later, but that's sort of the one shock that I think to the system that may still be on its way. And maybe it's not this year, but we'll talk about. Let's talk a little bit about the global economy then, because we've got people here from Europe and other countries. I mean, Europe's a continent, of course, but Japan. How do you see the rest of the world doing?
Yeah, well, I guess what I would say, and maybe this is, I hope it's not a very U.S. perspective, but when we talk to folks in Europe, they're pretty downbeat. But I think that the U.S. experience since the pandemic has been pretty standout on a number of metrics, and particularly productivity, which I think is interesting, and obviously related to technological innovation and trends like that. But when you look elsewhere, the recoveries that other economies have had have been pretty subpar, actually. Productivity growth has been stagnant to contractionary, especially in Europe. Investment trends, obviously we've had tight monetary policy, high interest rates, so that's putting some, downward pressure on investment. But actually, U.S. investment, despite that, has been okay. Elsewhere, it hasn't. It's been incredibly stagnant. So, when we talk to, our friends and colleagues in Europe, we speak with the folks that we know, within the ECB, they're pretty downbeat actually on the growth, the European growth model in general. And I guess kind of the old adage that the U.S. innovates and Europe regulates is very much kind of ingrained in how they're thinking lately. And I know that I've spoken to folks within the tech industry that have very much underscored the fact that it's very hard to operate in Europe. And so that in terms of longer term growth and innovation that drives longer term growth, I think you have to be more excited about the U.S.
And of course, we saw over the weekend that Governor Newsom vetoed SB 1047. But he did sign the other bill, which was disclosing the sources of data that went into your large language model, which people didn't seem to make a big noise about. So I think that was okay then. At least all the attention was focused on 1047. So, when we spoke, you talked about the multiple transformations, from brown to green and a couple of other things. Can you just talk us through sort of some of these sort of major transformations that are going on in the global economy right now and what they might mean for all of us here?
Yeah. So I talked about how economies are getting back to, quote, normal, but what is normal? And, and I would argue under the surface, when we were all, I guess sort of focusing on these pandemic-related shocks, could we buy, I don't know, toilet paper at the grocery store or whatever, you were having these secular trends that we would argue were actually probably accelerated by the pandemic.
For example?
So I'll give you some examples. So we think there's three big global, well, we would sort of distill it down into three big global transformations that we think are happening and will need to happen, call it over not only over a 3 to 5 year horizon, which is what we call a secular horizon, but over a super secular horizon. And as you said, these are, the renewable energy transformation, so the brown to green transformation, what we would call moving from a unipolar world order to a multipolar world order, so geopolitical transformations, and as a result of that, moves within the corporate sector to create supply chain resiliency instead of a focus on the most efficient and the most cost-efficient supply chains. And then the third one, which is obviously very important for this audience, is the digital transformation. I mean, I think all three of these things are kind of going on in the background, if you will, although maybe it's not even the background anymore. And our view in terms of what they mean is that each of these transformations will broadly result in winners and losers. And as a result of that, they'll probably create more macroeconomic volatility as you're getting, sort of stop-start policies. You're trying to figure out how to regulate AI, what's the best way to do it while growing it. You're trying to figure out how should, like Europe, should we regulate renewable energy production before we have base energy available, enough base energy available, and then you're kind of going through issues of energy insecurity. So it's just an environment that we think is difficult from a policy perspective. And it'll probably create more volatile economic cycles, potential for more inflationary shocks, more supply shocks. But I think over the longer run, after these transformations happen, it's going to create a world with just much more capacity, and that should be, ultimately that should be disinflationary or outright deflationary.
So talk to me. So that's interesting. You talk about brown to green, geopolitical transformations, this multipolar world, which you're already seeing. I mean, because one of the things I was reading, especially as we talk about the brown to green, after I read the Pimco report, these the metals that you need to support, like,
batteries,
nickel, lithium, copper, cobalt, whatever. We don't have a good supply chain for those, but China does.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of interesting. But you talk about winners and losers. Are you talking about countries and regions, or are you talking about companies, or both?
Well, I mean, I would say that it goes from countries and all the way from countries to companies to people. When you think about the brown to green transition, you have a shifting world order around what commodities people require, right? And it's getting away from more of the fossil fuel commodities, and that just means, countries that used to be powerful, that produced a lot of these fossil fuels, maybe their power is lessening within the global world order, right? And that has, the potential to have them, fighting back in ways in order to regain power. But as you also said, that there's going to be new commodities that will be needed. Obviously, the whole rare earth thing has been a focus in terms of policy circles. But you're absolutely right. Things like copper and lithium that China is usually or has been a world supplier of. It certainly will create other trade tensions in those places as well. So I do think you will have just global, regional shifts in terms of winners and losers. But on a company basis, I would think you also get winners and losers as well, because you have, it's the companies that win are the companies that learn how to navigate this new world order. They create the supply chain resiliencies, and they use these new innovative technologies to still get cost gains and efficiency gains, even while they're building redundancies. So there will be, I think there will be companies that win, and they'll be the first mover companies that do that. And then just on an individual level, as we know, these digital transformations, I mentioned, kind of jokingly that our George bot is kind of taking over for our, undergraduate interns. We still have undergraduate interns, obviously, but you're certainly going to probably have people that, will have to be retrained, and they'll have to go into, maybe the work as they know it will change, and everybody is probably not going to be a winner from that.
Yes, as you were speaking, I had two thoughts. One, on the second thought, it was one of the questions we're addressing very seriously at the business school is, what are we even training our undergraduate business graduates to be ready for? Because as you said, we're certainly seeing this with the consulting firms, and also I guess now with Pimco, that some of these entry-level jobs are going to be different. So I'm not saying all of it will be different, but some of it will be. And the other sort of thought you sparked in my head when you were talking about these, who's going to be better off, like I would never have predicted a few years ago that one of the largest data centers in the world was going to go into Kuwait. And and Abu Dhabi and Dubai, the UAE are huge players now. Because they've got tons of financial resources, but they have excess energy as well. And so all of a sudden they're becoming important players and again, it's going to be a technological advantage that will give them, like you said, geopolitical power, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
You brought up this bot. I'm going to jump a little bit out of sequence here, but Tell us a little bit about how you are using AI at Pimco, and then we'll get back to that. I'm just very curious to hear more about that.
Yeah. So I talked about we have this bot, and it's not only it's not only a large language model, but all of the econometric models that we use now are in Python, and so we can sort of feed that into into this thing. If anybody is familiar with the Federal Reserve's large-scale economic model of the U.S. economy, it's called FRBUS or FRBUS. They actually have a Python implementation of this as well. So we can it not only reads the newspaper, but it not only can we have it like sort of hooked up to Bloomberg, so it can kind of get data from Bloomberg, but it can also like read our models. And so I can literally say to it, what would be the economic effects of a 100 basis point shock to the 10-year interest rate? Tell me over the next couple of years what I should expect relative to a baseline for GDP growth, for the unemployment rate, for inflation. And then it sort of knows the model that I would usually use, and it provides charts and things like that. So I don't actually have to go and run that model anymore. So it's great for that in that perspective. You wanted to ask if
yeah. And you partnered with OpenAI to do this?
So we've been a partner with OpenAI. I want to say for 4 years now. So we've been working with them, but we also have computer scientists that we have sort of in-house as well that are very focused on working with these types of tools to enhance them for our specific needs. We have our own databases. Fed watching or just monetary policy watching is always a big deal. So we've loaded like every speech, every transcript historically that you could ever think of from Fed officials. And now we can just ask, pretend that you're Rich Clarida, pretend that you are Alan Greenspan. What were the lessons that you would have learned from this point in time? And it provides.
Did you say pretend you're a bridge player?
No, I was just saying Alan Greenspan.
Oh, okay.
Just anybody that was at the Federal Reserve, pretend you're that person, and it can give us that perspective very easily.
And how long did it take to train this? Because a lot of companies are actually building these very company-specific models, because you can adapt them, especially some of these open source models are quite adaptable.
Yeah.
What did it take to actually build I think you called him George?
Yeah.
I said him because you named him George.
Yeah, it was not my name, but it stuck. We have very innovative folks internally. It didn't take that much.
Interesting.
Yeah, like I said, that we've been working with these kinds of things for the last 4 years, and I would say the interest internally to figure out across our business the types of applications that we can just implement for personal productivity gains. We're literally testing it anywhere and everywhere that we can, and it hasn't really taken that much. As the thing that takes longer is just to get all of the data that you want to use in one place so it can sort of read it, and that's more of the tasking of it. But once you have that, it's pretty easy, and it does iterating through. It's kind of amazing how it gets faster, and it does get seemingly smarter.
Well, they iterate and they just keep learning, and the models get better and better. And which it's sort of interesting because if you talk to the people in this room, I'm sure they will tell you that sort of getting the data in one place is very, very difficult.
Yeah.
Especially if you're a manufacturing company or multi-divisional company. But you actually sort of led me to my next question anyway, so that's good. Okay. So it's sort of interesting because you're saying the world is going to be somewhat more regular, for lack of a better word. But there's still periodic uncertainty. And I think one of sort of the places where AI really can make a difference is when you have uncertainty. If you just think, for example, about something as simple as a routing algorithm that UPS or Amazon uses to deliver something to your house.
Yeah.
Those a few years ago, and I used to work on them when I was a PhD student, were deterministic. The route was determined the night before, and there was no changes.
Yeah.
And now, of course, you can incorporate sort of real-time considerations of what the routing algorithm should be. And you can apply that to any domain you think about.
Yeah.
So you sort of see that AI can really be sort of an extraordinarily valuable sort of resource to help firms navigate this uncertainty. And I think you're saying that you are using it in at Pimco in this way.
Yeah. So this is, in terms of an analogy, I'm not sure that it's exactly the routing algorithm analogy, but just in thinking about uncertainty. So we do a lot with, obviously as a global bond manager and investment manager, you think in terms of uncertainty and scenario analysis, but we try to place probabilities on various outcomes.
Yep.
And I don't know if anybody has read the Philip Titlock book or has been involved in, a Good Judgment Open, where you have these potential for super forecasters. So we do a lot internally on super forecasting. We have a bot that also now competes with us internally in terms of super forecasting. So assigning probabilities to various outcomes, and then over time, we track how good people are, who actually has an edge at what. And ultimately, the AI has been pretty good. And so even like with these measures of portfolio risk and thinking about trades, thinking about the distribution of outcomes, the bots are actually pretty decent at assigning reasonable probabilities.
What's the definition of a super forecaster in your book?
Well, there's, they have these like sort of Breyer scores or whatever. So it's literally, it's a measured thing over time on how well you assign probabilities, various a crowd, your other forecasters that you're going against. And you can kind of, you have a learning score, you have a Breyer score, and it's kind of how well you do in that game.
Does that go counter the efficient markets hypothesis?
I don't know. We hope that there's, in order to be an active bond manager, you have to believe that markets are at least inefficient enough for you to have an edge. So
there you go. That's the core thesis of your firm, isn't it? Yeah, and some of us who studied behavioral finance, I think, would share that perspective. One of the things you talked about, which I thought was interesting when we talked about AI, when we were planning for this, was everybody talks about the bias in AI systems, but not enough people talk about the biases that executives actually possess or leaders possess.
Yeah.
And you talked about the confidence intervals. Can you sort of share that sort of thinking with us?
Yeah.
Which is how AI or anything can actually help you sort of scenario plan and widen your aperture, perhaps?
Yeah. So I was actually just on a panel with Dr. Richard Thaler from the University of Chicago, and he was talking about a paper that another Pimco person had wrote on behavioral finance. And they basically, what they did was they took CFOs and they surveyed them. They asked them, and these were from various companies, and this was over time. And they asked them to forecast the equity market, so like the S&P, and not only give a point forecast for the returns, but to give an 80% confidence interval. And this was over time. And basically what they found was that the 80% confidence interval that the CEOs or CFOs were giving ex ante never actually incorporated 80% of the distribution of outcomes ex post. So they were not well calibrated. They were too narrow in the distribution of risks that they perceived. And it's interesting, when you ask Dr. Thaler, well, why would you? I mean, you literally these CEOs or CFOs should literally see what the markets have done over the last number of years. You should literally be able to have data that you can calculate 80th% confidence intervals or whatever. And his view was that, well, if I'm a CFO of a company, why would you pay me so much if I didn't have an edge and I didn't know what I was talking about? And I should have more confidence in a more narrow range as a result of that. But the reality is this overconfidence is actually, you're just not well calibrated. And it's not that you don't know what you're talking about, but it's just that if you are in a business scenario planning and planning for the tails, opening your mind to the actual distribution of risks as it is quite useful to think about, in how this could go wrong. What are the downside risks? And AI is actually pretty good at doing that and allowing you to think like that. One other thing that we do at Pimco, by the way, is this idea of pre-mortems. And we're actually trying to figure out how we can get AI more involved in this.
Like, why might you die? Is that a pre-mortem?
Exactly. Yeah. So the pre-mortem is you put on a trade. When you put on a trade or you invest in a company or whatever, it's hard to think that it's going to go poorly because you're excited about the investment. And the pre-mortems require you to basically say, this investment is going to go pear-shaped at some point in time, and I have to come up with the reasons ex ante before I make the investment on why it failed. And going through that exercise is a really nice way of sort of opening your mind. And we're trying to figure out ways that we can get AI involved in that as well. So it does try to take some of the bias, some of the less well-calibrated people out of this kind of process.
Yeah, that I think is really important for the conversation we're going to have tomorrow. Because, so let's say they're less well-calibrated in the world as it is today. And then you throw in something as disruptive as AI, at least as the way I see it, as very disruptive as AI. We're more likely than not, compared to, let's say, yesterday, that we're going to see more on the tail.
Yeah.
And so it becomes almost more important to sort of use these systems to sort of force companies, to force these executives to confront. Because oftentimes I think people don't see the disruption that's headed their way. And I didn't think of it in your terms, but really sort of the narrow aperture with sort of smaller, tighter confidence intervals than are probably warranted.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know we had kind of talked about this when we were chatting ahead of this, but there's been a lot of skepticism, I think, and I certainly have seen it in Pimco, and at least for us, I think there was a lot of skepticism until we got involved with OpenAI, and then I think it was very eye-opening for people to feel and touch what it could do. And I think that was really helpful instead of this being just something that wasn't very concrete, this kind of idea of this transformation. That I think was really important to the broader understanding. So we look at, obviously we look at a lot of government data. So the Census Bureau has actually asked the folks all of the establishments or businesses that are in the employment survey, how much, if at all, have they implemented AI? And that latest survey that they did basically suggests that implementation is only maybe 5% of the
5%.
businesses. Yeah. So the point that I would make is these people, it's almost like it's a nighty uncertainty, if you will. They don't even know what they don't know at this point, and it feels like it's coming so fast that I don't know how you can be well calibrated.
Exactly right. And it is 5% actually. And in fact, the Census Bureau now has, so they do the surveys, every 2 weeks.
Yep.
And AI, they've added 2 questions about AI use. I was in communication with them trying to get some data from them.
Oh, that's great. Okay.
So they have a longer survey, longer set of questions that they ask less often, but every 2 weeks they now ask 2 AI questions, which is basically, do you use AI today, and or have you used it in the last 2 weeks, and do you expect to use it in the next 6 months?
Yeah, and hopefully the growth will be exponential at some point. Right?
Hopefully.
Yeah.
But it is a little unnerving because there's so much money being invested by the AI suppliers. I know you have a position on the impact of AI on productivity. Can you walk us through what your position is?
Yeah. So we think AI is absolutely transformational. And I know this kind of goes without saying to this group, but the way that we've sort of described it to the folks that we talk to internally is that other transformational technologies we're helping people, people would come up with the ideas, and other transformational technologies would implement the ideas in potentially a more efficient way. This technology is literally helping you come up with the ideas. So it is absolutely transformational. I do think, though, in terms of the, and we're getting productivity gains, from it, but there's a lot of still experimentation. There's not a lot of implementation, at the broader corporate level. And so what we've argued is in terms of macro productivity gains, so like what you see in the macroeconomic data, we think it's maybe still, we're on the precipice of that. And we think you probably will have to get, well, not you probably, but you will have to get more investments, more capital deepening, literally in infrastructure. There's been a lot of focus on, like you said, electricity and, building out the grid, literally laying wires that are capable of dealing with the data centers on this. We do a lot of actual data center investment in the United States. So all of that type of infrastructure investment to support this, we think we're kind of on the precipice of that. So we're going to get a capital wave probably, and it's unclear how fast that will be before we get broader implementation and what will be more transformational productivity gains.
So what does a capital sort of investment translate to? So what's that going to do to the economy? Is this going to get much more capital deepening, as you said, which ultimately, but you're saying the productivity impacts, if I understand you correctly, are further away and not because we have to build out this grid, if you will?
Yeah, so that's what we would argue. And so, we've kind of, I mean, again, I guess this is a small sample bias, but we've looked at periods in the United States history where we can get data, where you've had these productivity booms. And really in kind of, call it modern history, we've had two. And one was in the 60s, and you had the US government that was, putting a lot of money into, scientific research, you had the space race, you had trade, global trade that was opening up, and that was creating, more innovation, I think, as well. But you had infrastructure investment, and you had the US government that was doing a lot of capital deepening, and we got a productivity boom associated with that. The 90s boom was associated with Netscape Navigator, with a lot of tech capex in the early 90s, which paved the way for that late 90s boom. And we look at other countries, across the world, you have similar trends. So you get this big investment burst, and then that tends to be followed, especially if it's technology, by a productivity burst. So we think, again, like we're kind of on the precipice of all of this. And this is kind of the exciting stuff that will be happening moving forward.
And these are the folks.
Yeah, exactly.
We're going to make it.
Yeah.
I want to go back to something that you said that I think I want to make sure we don't lose, which is, most capital investments sort of improve labor productivity kind of directly, right? You get a faster machine or a more powerful machine, the worker who works the machine gets more productive.
Yeah.
But when you talk about a technology like AI that actually helps in the creation of ideas, and there's a lot of research that shows that increasingly we are in an economy of intangible assets, even though we have a lot of physical assets, that ideas really matter. And I would probably argue, given your earlier comments, it's sort of the rate of innovation in the US versus perhaps Europe is what gives us sort of the advantage.
Yeah.
That's a really powerful thought there, right? Which is, if you can accelerate ideas, which means accelerate scientific discovery, but it doesn't even have to be that fancy. Right? It can just be, I understand my customers better, or I understand my operations better. Right? It doesn't necessarily have to be complicated science. I think the potential for the impact of ideas through these technology investments can be massive. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, I guess if you think, towards demographics, but you have, these demographic trends, which is resulting in slower population growth. So you have potentially fewer people or less growth of people that are coming up with these ideas. You need something to fill that gap, if you will. So having and ideas, I think, just in general are more difficult to come by as you get technological innovation. So I agree with you completely that just a technology that is literally helping to come up with some of these ideas is quite amazing, and I feel like we don't even understand what that means yet.
Yeah, and one of the things that sometimes gets lost is it's kind of recursive to in the following way, which AI is one of the only technologies that can improve itself. Mm-hmm. Right? So you have that feedback loop as well, which is it's making itself more powerful, which sort of pushes you further on sort of what are the ideas that we can discover.
Yeah.
What about the impact on that, which leads us to sort of innovation, new value creation? Because you talked a lot about efficiency gains. What about sort of these new companies that will emerge, or sort of breakthrough ideas? Do you have a position on that?
So just in general, I mean, Pimco's a bond manager, so we're less obviously in the VC space. So we always think about downside risks instead of new innovations. So I will say that you guys probably will tell me much more about that than I will tell you. But I guess what I would say is that certainly this is like a new and evolving industry. I think when we think about like changes in terms of how people work, I think we can always think to like the jobs that could be lost. But it's much more difficult to think about what are the new jobs that are going to be gained, what are the new companies, how are they going to interact with folks maybe like Pimco or others, it's this idea that we're like really on the precipice of this, and it's difficult to forecast, right? Because it's just so unknown.
And I think job loss is one of the big tensions around this. So I think there's going to be a lot more job transformation than job loss, because at the end of the day, these technologies impact you at the task level. So, but I don't think I'm a super forecaster yet. So we'll just
not many people are.